Alrighty, welcome, and I want to begin by saying a huge thank you for every step, choice, and action that you've taken to be able to be here today, and I hope that you offer yourself the same in being able to take a moment for expressing gratitude to yourself for every step, action, and choice that you have made to be able to arrive today to this conversation. I am so excited to be able to kind of cover and map out a neuroscientific and body-based understanding of intersectional relationships and the interplay of our mutual survivorship of interlocking systems of oppression as they come into play when we're doing trauma-sensitive, anti-oppressive, and healing work. So you might also call that, aka when my shit triggers your shit triggers my shit, and all of our shit's triggering each other as we're trying to do our absolute best work to be able to increase the likelihood of experiencing safety and connection and ease across systems of power. And so maybe a little bit about me. My name is Morgan Lee Vanderpool. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a non-binary human. And I'm facilitating this conversation from a place in the world that is the unceded territory of the Puyallup tribe, southern part of the Salish Nation, currently called, city's named Tacoma, Washington, up in the Pacific Northwest corner of the United States. That's the place, and I also want to express that this conversation has come from having the privilege and the honor of being able to have spent a lot of time crossing borders and boundaries, and getting to spend time with folks who are survivors of U.S. colonialism, both in the country where I live and all across the Americas. And so I also recognize as I'm facilitating this conversation that I honor that I'm presenting this information from my own kind of interesting identity of both being a survivor of and a complicit collaborator in systems of power and systems of violence. And I'm in my own recovery process of that mixed survivorship status. I've had the honor of accompanying survivors of complex trauma of interlocking systems of oppression in the kind of interconnected journey of nervous system restoration through movement and breath for many years. And it is my hope to be able to share some maps and frameworks that have supported that journey and understanding. And I want to do so from a place of deep honor and hope to do justice to the wisdom that has been shared with me in those relationships with the wise ones that have been my guides and the teachers along the way who have ventured with me in crossing borders and crossing boundaries in order to be able to connect. And I especially want to express gratitude to those who have experienced a greater multiplicity of violences that my position of privilege protects me from. And I want to thank them for having called me out and having called me in over the years to be able to share this wonderful information with me so that I hope to be able to share it with you and use the excess energy that I know my privilege allots me in being able to do this work. So, in order to have this conversation, I wanted to express some of the values and the assumptions that I'm holding as I'm sharing this information with you. So you know where my mind's at, you know where my heart's at, and can share a little bit of shared mentality. So one of the values is that we all come to this work with the most loving of intentions, and also that we are constantly being asked to grow, to expand our minds, to expand our capacities, and to challenge the things that we've been conditioned to believe over and over and over again so that we can move towards the restoration of complex trauma. I also value and assume that we are having this conversation amidst present moment, transgenerational and intersectional systems of violence that haven't stopped causing what they cause and acting the way they do. So in my mind and in my heart, I'm including, but not exclusively, systems of colonialism, slavery, misogyny, capitalism, etc. And we'll go in more detail about that. I'm also holding true that our nervous systems are plastic, they're adaptable, and I trust that the epigenetics of our bodies, the ways that our bodies are coded to perceive, to wire, to act, and communicate, is within our purview to recode. And we can do that through the impact of every breath, every thought, and every action. I'm also having this conversation under the understanding that there's no binaries, that this whole experience is one of multiplicity, of neurodiversity, and that each of us have a pretty fantastically unique weighted positionality and identity. I'm also understanding that inherently when we talk about trauma or systems of violence, we will feel them. It's impossible to not. So as we're having this conversation, please take care of yourself, please listen to your body, and understand that more than likely, we're gonna get a little bit uncomfortable, and that's part of the process. And last value and assumption is that we're centering the badassery of survivorship in this conversation, meaning that the more complex your survivorship and the more complex the systems you've survived, the stronger and the wiser and the more valuable your voice is into this conversation. So additionally, some givens that I'm holding true as we're having this conversation is that trauma happens in relationship, in every level of relationship, with yourself intrapersonally, with others interpersonally, with our community, with our ecosystem, with the political systems, with the systems of justice and global systems, etc., and that we are constantly co-informed by how safe or unsafe any of those relationships have been. And as challenging as it is, trauma restoration and moving towards anti-oppressive work has to happen within the messiness and the complexities of those relationships. I'm using the definition of complex trauma as defined as the survivorship of interlocking systems of oppression and violence. So a big given that I'm holding very true at the center of this conversation, and is very pivotal to our capacity to be able to comprehend and interact with this body-centric understanding of how our stuff triggers each other, is to take into consideration that our neurological systems of survival, so like our sympathetic nervous system and our vagal nerve, that are constantly measuring moment to moment, breath to breath, movement by movement on our own felt sense of safety, those systems are going to lead and communicate and act on our behalf, mostly subconsciously, complicitly, and kind of without our consent. Anytime our body or our sense of self experience a felt sense of threat to their integrity. And that happens in relationship with self and relationship with others. I'm also holding true that our neurodiversity is coded epigenetically by how our ancestors and how our communities have survived. And we'll repeat those survival patterns unless we consciously address them through trauma-sensitive relationship with self and others. That's informed by sharing power via centering the badassery of survivorship of the systems of oppression. So we gotta kind of invert the system to heal the system is one way that I conceptualize it, and we'll go into that more. Some of the goals that I have for this conversation. One is to give a couple of maps, visual maps and conceptual maps that have supported me in understanding how to combine an increased interoceptive awareness of our bodies and our bodies' responses, how we're moving and breathing in relationship with each other, increased with and mixed with an increased intersectional awareness, an awareness of how systems of power come together and our unique identities. And the hope with all of that is to increase compassion and understanding for our automatic and survival responses to each other. My hope as well, and have a goal of centering the conversation on body-centric countertransference and how our survival systems communicate while we're embedded in systems of power. To thus have the goal of increasing equitable sharing of power through increased awareness of how systems of violence influence how we relate to one another. And my hope as well is to kind of reposition this discussion around countertransference outside of kind of the typical clinical application, and to rather examine it as a present moment, valid co-triggering to a relational dynamic that is embedded in systems of oppression and power and violence that we feel in our bodies. And the hope then is to increase relational accountability on behalf of any folks in relationships that might hold more of the position of power. And in the relationship when it has to do with facilitating healing services or facilitating services that are meant for the restoration of complex trauma, that's the provider or the facilitator of the services. And my hope is to complete all of these goals while continuing to honor the wisdom of our bodies and our survival responses, and kind of mapping them out so they make a little bit more sense as we try to connect. So the next piece of our conversation is to get a little bit more detailed about how our bodies and the signals within them and how we perceive our world and relate with each other have an impact on what parts of our brain turn on and turn off based off of how much of a felt sense of safety we have moment to moment, or a felt sense of ease. So remember that we're embedding that in the value that our bodies and our brains are epigenetically coded based off of our own lived experience in the body that we have here, and also all of our ancestors feeding into how those are coded to pick up on internal stimuli, both through our movements and our own breath, and then sensations that we feel while in relationship with each other based off of how we perceive the identity of the folks that we're in relationship with. So at any moment, our body is consistently sending signals up towards our brain, and our brain's job is to filter them out, interpret them, and be able to understand them. And so with every breath and every movement, one of the first places that those signals arrive to is our amygdala. And so our amygdala's job, albeit a tiny little almond-shaped thing at the base of your brain, is to figure out if those signals equate to a sense of safety or to a sense of lack of safety. And should it pick up on any signals, tension in your breath, an interesting proximity of somebody, their body language, your body language, if it matches any patterns that had been previously associated with somebody taking power over you, you will then end up automatically tripping a flight, fight, freeze, submit, or fawn response. We can also kind of translate fight and flight as resist and avoid. Those might be some words that connect a little bit more as we sense them in relationships where we're trying to connect. So we're not actually going to fight somebody off. We're not going to run away, but we may end up resisting, or we may end up avoiding certain feelings, thoughts, interactions. And remembering as well that this is built off of the wisdom of our ancestors and built off of the historical context in which we exist and the present moment multiple systems that we exist in. Our amygdala is really, really, really good at picking up threat. If, though, it sounds that alarm of flight, fight, freeze, submit, or fawn, then some other structures for moving further forward in our brains that require more resources that aren't part of our survival response don't necessarily get as much activity or conduction, and those are the ones that we need and be able to actually connect. And so some things that I want to point out around our amygdala as well is that it's primed to pick up on balances or imbalances of power through movements, particularly in moments in which we have a felt sense in which we're being unseen, unheard, or invalidated in our own survivorship. And so if for any reason the alarm system of the amygdala is going off, one place that is then going to get communicated to turn off actually, or have less conduction, is our insula. So our insula's job is to take all the felt sort of sensations within our body and move them forward to a concept of self. So in one way you can kind of call the insula as like the seat of I am, or that I exist. And so when our alarm of fight, flight, freeze, submit, or fawn are going off, it's really hard to have a felt sense of self. Additionally, if this alarm is going off way back here, another area that has a little bit of a harder time conducting authentically is your Broca's area. Your Broca's area's job is language production. It's the place in which it sends all the signals forward to move your tongue and your throat and make words come out. So if your amygdala is firing its alarm system of fight, flight, freeze, submit, or fawn, our words are going to come out through those responses. We may end up saying things we wish we didn't say, and we may end up not being able to say something that we wish we could. And so just to kind of like break it down a little bit, response by response, our Broca's area, if it's following an avoid response, we're going to curve a conversation away from something that feels threatening. If it's a fight response, we're going to use words to resist it. We're going to push back with our words. If it's a freeze response, more often than not, our tongue's going to go in knots and we're not going to be able to say what we want. A submit response means that we will probably move the conversation to submit to the powers that be in that conversation to make the conversation just go. And a fawn response will mean that our words will start to agree with the powers that be, even if we don't authentically, for our own sake, for our own identity, and for our own survivorship, actually agree with the systems of power. And we do all of these things for self-preservation, to be able to make sure that we can continue to survive. So it's tricky when we're considering imbalances of power, is that folks who may experience a little bit more ease within systems of power don't necessarily, but may not be looking for folks' responses as responses of having a felt sense of threat. They may receive these flight, fight, freeze, submit, or fawn verbal responses, and also our body posturing as ones that feel incongruent because of not necessarily knowing how to tune in to somebody else's felt sense of threat based off of their positionality. At any moment, based off of our breath rate, any muscular tension, or any other sort of like relational or external stimuli, it's possible that our amygdala is going to pick up on a felt sense of threat to either a sense of self or our own body's integrity. And so part of the work that we're practicing in being able to address how my shit triggers your shit and your shit triggers my shit while we're trying to have these relationships is that the tricky part behind all of this is that your amygdala will fire these same responses both to when a sense of self or an idea of self is under threat, as well as your actual survivorship, like your actual potential of encountering threat or the inability to be able to survive that day. And so what happens is that conversations get really tricky because if there is a felt sense of self that's being put at risk, like I'm a good human, I'm trying my best, or I have the best of intentions, and when we get somebody else's survival response, that idea of self tends to kind of get put at risk, and we'll go into our own fight, flight, freeze, resist, avoid, or resist, or fawn response. And so what happens is that this conversation, because of the way that our survival systems are the first to come along evolutionarily, everything else in the brain follows along from them. And so if this alarm system's tripping, then our prefrontal cortex will also kind of follow along. And our prefrontal cortex, it's in charge of so many beautiful things, but some ways we can sort of talk about it is that it's in charge of our perception, meaning making, also like idea resonance and shared perspective taking. And so if the amygdala is going off, we're remembering that there's not as many resources being allocated forward in this kind of like bottom-up conduction direction, which is based off of survival. And so what will be happening is that the amygdala is going to be kind of communicating on our behalf, and that our perceptions are going to be picking up on engaging in a fight, flight, freeze, submit, or fawn responses. And so our capacity to connect and mutually understand each other gets pretty compromised. So as we move into kind of talking about systems of oppression and the way that we experience them as individuals and in relationship with each other, we're keeping in mind that this is kind of how, this is how our bodies communicate to our brain, and how we end up feeling and interacting in relationship with each other. So this next piece of the conversation is kind of an adaptation of Leticia Nieto's addressing model and otherwise voices that have talked about systems of oppression for much longer than I have had access to. And so here in a list are the aspects of our identity that, based off of how systems of power interact with one another, we can experience a variation of oppression. And so this is a place where we're returning to that value of non-binaries or no binaries. In Leticia Nieto's model, she talks about target and agent identities, which tends to put us kind of in these opposing places. As soon as there's opposition, that amygdala is going to go off. So my hope here is that we can take a little bit of time to kind of put on a scale of 0 to 10, and hopefully you'll be able to do this for yourself and folks who you're in relationship with, to kind of assess along any of these lines of identity how much you might experience a system of oppression. And so each of these, like race, age, sexual identity, for example, is a representation of how little or how much somebody might interact on a day-to-day basis with racism and experience that weight of oppression. On a day-to-day basis and moment-to-moment basis, experiencing ageism. So each of these are connected to a system of violence. Sexual identity is related to queerphobia, homophobia. Gender identity is related to transphobia and other forms of gender-based violence. Socioeconomic access is related to the system of oppression of like capitalism and neoliberalism. and commodification, any system of commodification, physical ability related to the system of violence of ableism, body politics, lack of kind of like focus on neurotypicality, and you can kind of move on the institution of marriage, systems of immigration, xenophobia. Colorism is also mixed in with race and ethnicity. Depending on your nation of origin, you may or may not experience oppression. Your religious identity, political identity, and your ancestry, which includes having your ancestors have been victimized by systems like colonialism, slavery, etc. So the work here is to consider that each of these has its own particular point, and like to help quantify it and maybe make it a little bit more simple and digestible, because this stuff is huge and expansive and has a lot of multiplicity to it, is to maybe give yourself and the folks you're spending time with a rating between like 0 to 10. Thinking about like the whole world in comparison to as many people as you can think of, how little or how much oppression do you experience on these lines? And go one by one and give a rate from like 0 to 10. And so for some you're going to have really high numbers, for some you're going to have really low, and for some you're going to have somewhere in between. And so this is where we come into kind of like a visual map of how we can come to a little bit of a clearer understanding of like the nuances of how systems of oppression might feel in a body. So what I have here is a little bit of a representation of what you might call your positionality. So your positionality is the way in which all of these lines of identity upon which you may experience the weight of oppression, the positionality is how they all come together into an intersection. This positionality is not fixed, it is dependent upon environment. So if you go to a different country, move to a different community, transition groups of friends, your positionality in how that's equated to your access to power can be a little bit motile, can fluctuate depending on the context you're in. So these lines might move a little bit, your numbers may slightly change. But overall, the way they come together is your positionality. And so I'm going to get a little bit cheesy and hopefully maybe bring up some interesting childhood memories for those of you that might have grown up with this game called Kerplunk. So this is a way that I conceptualize systems of power. And so that each of these sticks are kind of like the lines of identity here that you may or may not experience oppression along. And depending on how they come together, you might see in this little column there's a bunch of marbles. Depending on how this formation comes together, you carry more or less marbles. And so we can equate that to kind of like the felt sense of the weight of oppression. If you've ever played this game before, or you can kind of watch, as you sort of start to pull sticks out, marbles start to fall. And maybe I'll take a few more. But what I'm trying to point out, there we go, is that if you have low numbers, it's kind of like your sticks are sticking out, because they don't actually crisscross. You don't have necessarily a felt sense of the system of oppression if your numbers are pretty low. And what happens is that with those low numbers and those sticks sticking out, we don't necessarily have that felt sense, and so we're walking around with these ideas and identities and capacities of understanding ourselves that are based off of never having maybe interacted with certain systems. We don't know how they feel in our bodies, and that kind of lack of experience ends up bumping up against folks who may have a lot of sticks intersecting with all the marbles holding them, and every time our stick that might have low numbers is sticking out, comes into our interaction with them, it makes folks feel the weight of the marbles. Part of this work as well is becoming aware of which sticks are sticking out, and so when you do, it is very possible that as you start to kind of like retract that back in, you will start to feel, at least conceptually, the weight of that system. And that in and of itself will trigger a felt sense of dis-ease, and your amygdala will go off. And we'll interpret that experience with the same survival mechanism. And so it's a little bit complicated, and also I hope that with this sort of interstellar conglomeration of sticks, that we can have a little bit more of a kind of a nuanced and practical understanding of how all of these lines come together, to be able to have more of a nuanced understanding of the weight of oppression as we're experiencing it in relationship. So taking that model of understanding that like all of the different lines of identity come together in a positionality constellation of sorts that holds a varied weight of oppression for each of those marbles that might be held by your sticks that by high numbers are stuck in that kerplunk constellation. Something to consider is that the lines that may have lower numbers, the ways that our survival systems tend to survive that bypassing, because we're still existing within the systems, but when we have low numbers, then we've typically survived that system by avoiding it, by ignoring it, and maybe having submitted to it or fawned to it to make sure that we can stay alive. And so if we have been privileged enough to have avoided that system of oppression, then we typically can't hear it as well or see it as well. And maybe when we do, we maybe feel uncomfortable. And in that instant of discomfort, that's when our fight, fight, freeze, submit, or fawn response engages. So kind of a statement of inclusion for all of the numbers, the highs, the lows, the middles, is that we are all acting within these systems of oppression. And each line of oppression is survived uniquely by each human. We gain a skill set to get through it. We have a skill set to get through racism. We have a survival skill set to get through sexism and gender-based identity, to get through the way in which capitalism inflicts systems of poverty, and the body politics associated with our body size. We all have our own survival mechanisms for those. And the goal with this perspective of noticing the multiplicity of how our positionalities are created is to validate the survival response of the persons who experience the weight, the higher numbers of the systems of oppression, and each of ours actually as well, to the accurate level in which we execute our badassery of survivorship. To get really pristine about knowing how our positionalities are actually weighted within the systems that we're interacting with. Also, we want to have the goal of putting into perspective the way in which our positionality alone, so the ways that our numbers come together, particularly if a lot of low numbers are coming together, can be perceived as a threat in and of itself, because there is the felt sense of knowing that we, if you have low numbers, have ended up bypassing or being able to avoid the impacts of violence of that system. And so that positionality alone could be perceived as a threat and make somebody who experiences a lot of low numbers feel inaccessible for connection and collaboration because of that lack of knowing, a lack of lived experience. And also we can take into consideration, and it's really helpful to know that each of those marbles that anybody might be carrying because of their positionality is a felt sensed wound that deserves a ton of attention, care, and mutual support that's chosen by that person, and a deep, deep validation of the badassery of their survivorship. And so our bodies are super wise. They carry all of the information from the resilience and the survivorship of our ancestors and our communities as we've been informed by our existence on this planet. And our bodies have a felt sense of what others have survived by having survived the same system around each other. And so something to consider, that when our high numbers are met in relationship with somebody that has lower numbers along that line of identity, then we tend to self-protect from the feared outcome of feeling unseen, unheard, and invalidated in our survivorship. When our low numbers are met with somebody else's high numbers, then we have the propensity to self-protect by disassociating from our lack of lived experience. And we end up kind of defending the sense of self that has only been affirmed by the systems of power themselves. So, a visualization that's helped me to sort of consider what intersectional countertransference feels like when two people's positionalities, at minimum, come together. And so here we have the star of all of the different survival responses that each person might be having. So, fight or resist, flee or avoid, freeze, submit, and fawn. And then at the center of that really vital survival system, there's the person that is experiencing their unique positionality. The higher numbers are intersected across the person's felt experience. And with each higher number, there is a particular weight of how many marbles of the systems of oppression that they're navigating and skillfully surviving on every day. And then for any low numbers, those are the ones that are sitting kind of out here and have the potential, as this person's kind of like cycling in this relationship of connection, that end up poking and activating somebody who might be experiencing the marble that this person may not have to hold based off of their lower numbers, and that combine to create their positionality. And so this diagram helps me sort of visualize ways in which we can explore how our positionalities are interacting with each other in a way to be able to use it as a system of checking power and checking for power imbalances that create active countertransference. When my shit triggers your shit triggers my shit. And because it's so complex and there's so many moving pieces and how they're interacting with each other, I'm hoping that this visual can kind of like open up enough space or a larger container to actually include the felt sense of relationship and the complexities of what it feels like to survive systems of oppression. And so because of how much we need to be able to include and pay attention to be able to facilitate the opportunity of being able to connect, it invites an opportunity to kind of like slow down enough to be able to identify all the different systems that are interplaying with one another. Something to consider too is that when multiple low numbers along these aspects of identity come together, there kind of can become patterns of behavior that are only reinforced by positions of privilege. And so we can kind of call those like pockets of privileged interactions. And they tend to be kind of present in healing spaces. And so it's our work to create a greater awareness around them. And so if for some reason you have, based off of privilege, survived patriarchal education, survived sexism, and survived other privileged hierarchical values through a fawn or a submit response to that system, then we tend to kind of have internalized certain patterns of behavior like perfectionism, a sense of being assured comfort, and different dynamics of maybe kind of like privileged saviorism as well. So being mindful that these can kind of come together in certain places and in certain cultural dynamics. And when we're doing this work and trying to address minimizing the impact of countertransference, it's really helpful to name the system we are being activated by, or the system that we have survived, while actively including and being really validating of adaptive trauma responses when our amygdala is doing its job to make sure that we can continue to survive. And so some questions that we could ask that I feel like can be helpful in this exploration of getting a little bit more present to how systems of oppression impact our day-to-day relationships is to ask, like, what marble is the person that I'm in relationship with supporting that I might not be seeing, that I'm unseeing or unfeeling? Additionally, asking some questions about how can I learn about that marble and what it feels like to sustain for that person so that I don't make it harder to hold? And then how do I show up and do what I can to make it less challenging to navigate relationship with me because I'm paying attention to the weight of the marbles that somebody might be holding on a day-to-day basis? And then in that, validating the intensity of the marbles that that person is holding. And then what work can I commit to decrease the impact of those systems of oppression, both on myself and anybody that I'm in relationship with? So for me, being able to kind of take this infinite flow of constant body communication while being embedded in systems of oppression, it helps me to be able to take a step back to not assume that there's the necessary trust and ease and connection to be able to do trauma-sensitive work and anti-oppressive work when it hasn't been built yet. We have to build across so many lines of difference, and it takes time and attention and a lot of presence to the multiplicity of experience of everybody involved. And so this framework helps me to visualize what it feels like to slow down and earn trust. It also helps, I think, to kind of depersonalize it a little bit, being able to recognize that we've all survived systems of oppression. And we need to be able to name our own relationships with these systems of power. They're undeniable. They're happening moment to moment. And this is all done through increasing our own interoceptive awareness of when our flight, fight, freeze, submit, or fawn responses are being activated in our bodies, how we're breathing, how we're feeling, how we're moving, and how those may be responding in relationship to systems of power. Recognizing that our fight, flight, freeze, submit, or fawn response activates when our identities are legit under threat of systems of power, or if it's an idea of self that is under threat by being in relationships with other people. And so this is laborious and super worthwhile grief work. It'll definitely bring up a shit ton of unaddressed wounds of what we've survived, and also wounds around things that we've unintentionally or unconsciously caused by cooperating with systems of oppression. And so our hope, I think, is to practice acting from a place of knowing that most of us are a super fascinating mixture of a complicit collaborator with systems of oppression and a survivor of those same systems. And that our amygdala and survival responses require equitable validation and opportunities to be seen, felt, heard, understood, and validated to the accurate weight of our survivorship. And so, to conclude, I just want to say thank you for your commitment to this work, for your commitment to yourself, for your commitment to your communities. And I hope that you all are granted space, time, and accessibility to moments to be able to learn what it feels like to connect to yourself and to others at a pace and in a way that honors your survivorship. Thank you.